Hey everyone, this is the Transformative Media Organizing Skillshare series, and we are live with our Skillshare on defining your media organizing with Puck Low. Um, so we're excited. This is the last of our Skillshare series for 2016 that's scheduled so far, um, and we're happy to get going with it. So take it away, Puck.
All right, awesome. Um, can we get the slide up, please, Diana? Oops. Do you folks see that as the because I don't, but
Yeah, what we see will be, and what the viewers see is a little bit different than what you'll see, but it has a slide up defining your media organizing project is up right now.
okay, cool. Great. The next slide, please. All right, well, hello everyone, and thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really psyched to be here. As Sasha mentioned, my name is Puck Low. I'm an independent journalist, filmmaker, and researcher. I work with different community groups and activists to make media that complements or pushes forward radical political projects. Most of my work these days focuses on themes of state and gendered violence or carceral and liberatory spaces. My background and orientation is political organizing, mostly around prison abolition, racial and economic justice. I began publishing articles and producing radio stories during the counter-globalization moment in the early 2000s. In the last decade, I've also worked as a staff and freelance journalist for left media outfits and also conventional NPR-type radio stations and other market-driven outlets. At those kinds of places, I've seen up close how murders committed by cops get reworded by editors as officer-involved shootings, how press releases from left groups are barely glanced at and thrown away, and how reporters typically relate to activists and community members as non-credible sources and subjects to mine for personal stories and access. Next slide, please. Over the years, I've also tried to find ways to work with activists and community groups when, as a journalist, my paycheck relies on publishing quality work, but as a radical social movement person, my heart ultimately cares about transforming the world and supporting radical efforts to do so. So this workshop pulls together some of my thoughts about the potential for activists to organize for change by initiating media projects, with and without professional journalists and media makers. I hope it can draw from your experiences as well. Next slide. So today we're going to go through some ideas, definitions, and approaches to media project-based organizing. We'll look at different types of media organizing projects and approaches to that work, ranging from DIY and horizontally structured projects to more conventional collaborations with mainstream reporters and documentarians, and everything that falls between. And the goal is that everyone will walk away from here with tools to assess and choose a media project that fits their needs. Next slide. So in this first part, I'll talk about a few different media organizing models and projects and collaborations I've worked on in order just to give a sense of what's out there and what's possible. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. So many of us are familiar with an approach called something like communications or media strategy. And this is essentially a public relations model which comes from commercial advertising. Many of us have had media trainings where we become acquainted with the format of the press release. We talk about framing an issue, having talking points, coming up with a communications strategy. We've labored over our contact list of journalists that we reach out to when we want publicity. We roll out the report to coincide with some strategically chosen day, Trans Day of Action, Day Against Police Brutality, right before a local election. Next slide, please. This approach might be called working the system, and it generally relies heavily on experienced people, sometimes communications professionals or spokespeople, being able to engage and interest people in positions of relative authority or power, people like politicians, celebrities, lawyers, journalists, editors, and producers. The biggest flaw and risk with this model is that we generally have no control over what is currently being deemed worth caring about in the mass media. What matters constantly changes and is often arbitrary, based on factors far more random than movement organizing. Furthermore, in order to streamline a message, complexities or nuances are often sacrificed, and these can have harmful consequences in movement work. For example, a message like immigrants are not criminals. Next slide, please. However, when the communications PR approach works, the results can be extremely visible. Op-eds or articles in the New York Times, a commercially successful documentary film about the topic in the campaign, organizers appearing on TV shows. So that's one end of the spectrum that folks might think about when we talk about media organizing. Next slide. And next slide. On the other end of the spectrum are media projects that we make ourselves. We could call this end of the spectrum for us by us. There's usually a learning or a training component in these projects, or some level of creative experimentation. In this category, we could include short videos made by community members who go through a production training program that we run. We could include a traveling performance or an art installation that shows audiences how small a solitary confinement cell is, or how isolated migrant farm workers are. It could be an oral history archive recorded by a member of a local movement. These kinds of media projects tend to be more participatory for more people, offer its producers and participants greater creative and political control, and can be more conversational and less didactic in tone. They're generally better, therefore, at generating more reflexive, complex, or nuanced ideas. These projects also tend to be smaller in scale, have tinier audiences, and are limited in distribution. Next slide, please. Somewhere in the middle of the spectrum might be social media campaigns like Survived and Punished, which connect different cases of domestic violence survivors who face incarceration or deportation. Collaborations with allied artists, documentarians, researchers, and academics and this like might go here too. Next slide. So what kinds of media projects or campaigns have you or your organization worked on? The point isn't that there is a better or a worse, but that different media organizing approaches do different things and can be chosen deliberately. So today we'll have time for each person here to talk about a media project or campaign they've worked on and to come up with a new idea or approach based on the work you want to do in the future. We'll evaluate how each project or campaign idea would require different kinds of participation from different sets of people, build power differently, draw on and amplify different skill sets and values. Next slide, please. So here I was hoping that we could open it up and get some examples from you all. And we'll be coming back to these examples as we go through the rest of this workshop. So it's not very important to give us all the details now, but more the broad outline of it. And as we go through other stuff, I'll probably come back and ask more questions and try to relate your example to some of the stuff that we'll be going through. So yeah, does anyone want to give an example of a media project or a campaign that you worked on and answer these 3 questions that are on the screen?
Hi, this is Harlan. Hey, Joanne. I just would like to share real quickly in that I was doing a talk at the University of British Columbia and talking and discussing two-spirit issues. And so it was to increase the visibility as well as some public education and community education around who two-spirit people are. And so Ganarji, I don't know what Ganarji's last name, but she's with the Vancouver Public Radio. And so she did an interview. Then I did a radio interview with Native Wave Radio, Waves Radio out at UVic, University of British Columbia, University of Victoria. And then lo and behold, CBC Vancouver reached out to me. And basically CBC Radio is like NPR of the North. And then they gave me a prime location to talk about this issue. And when I went back to New York, this is when I was living in New York at the time, as I talked to my good friend Carla Zanoni, as head of the Wall Street Journal social media engagement. And if your intention is to shoot for like the Wall Street Journal or like for the big players, is don't focus your gaze there. Focus it locally, because those big people, they monitor the chatter and what's going on in local press. And so to get a foothold in is to get your attention to your local papers, your local radio stations, and they will actually approach you if you get enough of a chatter going on in locally. So think locally, and nationally will come along.
Cool. Thanks for that story, Harlan. Does anyone else have a experience or a campaign or a project they'd like to share?
Jess, would you be willing to share a little bit about the campaign y'all are working on and the website that you launched?
Sure. So we at Solutions Not Punishment Coalition and the Racial Justice Action Center, we've been working on this campaign around implementing pre-arrest diversion in Atlanta, which is kind of a larger campaign around figuring out how to challenge criminalization and arrests and the wide range of tactics that APD uses to criminalize and lock up our folks. It's been interesting because we've been doing building out the website alongside we've been doing our campaign work. And so part of what's been happening is that we have had these almost 3 different pieces of work. We've had this like media work around like the pre-arrest diversion work itself, which we actually won in December, and had as of 2 weeks ago, I think a week or 2 weeks ago, we had our first meeting of the pre-arrest diversion team. It was actually this amazing moment because we had on one of the main Atlanta news sites, we had this piece around pre-arrest diversion, and above it was some of our folks at an action in Atlanta. It's kind of highlighting the problem and highlighting the solution, both with SNAPCO. Not everyone knowing that it was both SNAPCO, but SNAPCO was involved with both of those. And then we have this piece around kind of building up our website and having a really powerful online resource, as well as kind of a report that we released and we're working on re-releasing. Because we were going to re-release it in June, and then kind of what our title for the report is, the most dangerous thing out there is the police. And we also knew kind of post Orlando moment and the ways in which everything was going down, we knew that wasn't the right time to relaunch it. Just in terms of like we didn't have the capacity, emotional and otherwise, and then we also just were trying to move hard. And then I think lastly, one of our sister organizations and one of the organizations inside SNAPCO, Women on the Rise, is working on a campaign around Alexia. And she, what's been interesting in this political moment in Atlanta is they've taken over a year they haven't shown anything around the video. They think they finally just showed the video to the family. But they basically just came out and announced that they're not putting charges right after they announced charges in firing for a cop who killed another person in Atlanta. And so we're trying to figure out how to like move all these pieces of the campaign work, and also have like a strong media strategy aligned with it. Which was, I think, we've been working with Rad on and some other folks to kind of really strengthen and tighten that up. But I just feel like there's a lot of these different moving pieces, and kind of, for me as someone who's been really involved with the website, like how do I have all those moving pieces in our website in a way that's actually useful, navigatable, and isn't just an overload of information, right? So that's what some of the things that are in my mind.
Cool, thank you. And then maybe one more quick example, and then I can give a couple examples of my own from some, and then we can have like a bigger discussion.
Javon, I don't know if your connection will let you participate in this. Do you want to share something?
Yeah. Let's see how good the internet's in Google is, right? Where we are currently running this campaign around the Southern Movement Assembly and the Southern People's Initiatives, and it's trying to pull together work that's happening throughout the South, and kind of tie a thread through all of that. You know, so it's kind of multifaceted in that we're drawing a thread of how we see it all connecting, but then the ground is like feeding into it as well with like what's going on in local communities and what's going on around the South. So I think some things that we're doing right is we're starting to draw out what our thread is, but because we have so many alternative threads coming in too, it's been real difficult to figure out what is like how to draw that into a cohesive vision that like someone who hasn't been involved can really understand really quickly, rather than like having to read through like a whole ton of information and watch videos and listen to calls, etc. Right? So how do you continue adding to something and creating a cohesive synthesis thread while continually creating something new?
Sweet, thank you. Okay, so what I was thinking is, you know, everyone like remember what we just talked about, and then I was going to give 3 examples from my own experiences of different kinds of collaborations or partnerships I've had with community groups and activists, coming from either like wearing the journalist hat at the moment, or wearing less of the journalist hat and more of like the social movement person hat. And I think it'd be interesting to just think about all these different experiences and what they have in common with each other, and you know what kind of power dynamics exist. So next slide, please, Diana. So yeah, these are 3 different examples of projects that I've worked on, and I was hoping they would just give a sense to you all of the different groups' political needs around media, and how different approaches to those media collaborations came about because of the vision that the groups had, or the different needs, and then also because, and sometimes it's the default model that's out there. So this is one extreme end of the spectrum. And this was an audio documentary that came out of a partnership between the Social Movement's Oral History Project, which is an all-volunteer documentarian group that I worked with, and this organization from Chicago, Young Women's Empowerment Project, or YWEP. So I had run into YWEP's main organizer at a conference in New York a few years ago. And because we had met in various insight spaces in the past, we very quickly built trust and were talking, and we came up with this idea to work on a documentary type project together, because at that time YWEP had lost all its funding and was trying to figure out ways to sort of ease the strain, and because they provided so many survival services in their community. So YWEP works with youth that sold sex, and at that time that we were talking about working on this half-hour audio documentary, the organization was coming up with different ways, under the radar ways, to continue providing harm reduction services to the young people that rely on the group. So for instance, one person was running a needle exchange out of her garage, completely unsupported by state or institutional funding. And YWEP wanted to make this audio documentary to detail this kind of response and other efforts to transition out of being a funded on-the-books nonprofit. Kind of weirdly, the initial catalyst for this project was that they had gotten a grant that required them to document why they were closing. So that was a little strange, but YWEP decided to use this opportunity to do a bigger project and to reflect kind of more holistically and generally on their process and the lessons they learned from, you know, being a nonprofit and then now not being a nonprofit and working with this extremely vulnerable population. And during the same time, in the mainstream press, there were headlines of ultra-sensational hype and reporting around the sex trade and its participants. There was legislation in Illinois that was seeking to target adult allies and supporters of youth in the sex trade and charge them as traffickers. It was really controversial. One young woman that YWEP worked with ended up getting deported after her identity was revealed by a reporter who, you know, didn't mean to do harm, but also didn't realize the impact that their article would have. So because of all of this, YWEP was extremely protective of its members and its participants, and this invariably shaped the approach that we took with them to documenting. And there were so many challenges and learning experience in figuring out how to craft a media project with them. And they had so many particular needs. And so for one thing, the audience that the organizers had in mind for the audio doc was very, very specific. It was other youth in the sex trade, other organizers in the field whose work also faced being defunded. And these people had lots of specialized knowledge about the issues. So unlike most of the, quote, general public, they didn't need any background info or context to understand YWAP's story. Other challenges for storytellers like me or my colleagues who were working with them, the organizers and members had developed their own jargon, which they used constantly and were reluctant ever to define. Anonymity was extremely important to YWAP, so no one was ever introduced in the audio piece, so you had to kind of figure out in context who everyone might be and their relationships with each other. And that made for some really confusing listening at times. And then additionally, the stories that everyone was telling were more memories. So they were about things that already happened. Everything was past tense, and there was no actual action unfolding that was moving the listener through time and space. So my impulse, because of my training and my past work, was to try to develop this like narrative arc and explain the political climate and provide history and analysis and focus on like main characters. And YWAP didn't care about any of this. So their needs were, they had this grant requirement that they had to fulfill. Anonymity had to be respected. There was no interest in recapping history or political context, but they were very, very interested in talking about their politics, kind of in an abstract way. And the contained project had to be done in a few months. So those were some of the criteria. And in the end, we decided it made most sense for us to train their main organizer to conduct oral history interviews with the members, and for us to edit those instead. So we couldn't interview a lot of these youth because they just simply didn't know or trust us. And in this case, trust is so crucial, and the goals were so specific as to what kinds of questions should be answered and how. So we ended up getting all of the interview files, and then we cut one sort of long documentary for them that would, based on their ask of us, which was to tell the YWAP story of how they were forced to close and what they were doing about it. One thing I should add is that they fundraised themselves to pay us. So, that was happening rather than us getting paid by an outside source. Not surprisingly, we worked well past the point where we were being compensated, so we were putting in a lot of extra time. And as a result, the technical quality of the project really suffered. Once we went over budget, we had to rely on open source editing programs instead of being able to pay for or borrow industry standard software. I couldn't afford to spend too much time cleaning up the bad edits that other people who were still learning were leaving. So the technical quality on the end product, is not industry standard for what it's worth, and that was not a huge concern for YWAP. And ultimately, the accountability was very obvious because they were paying us and we were aligned with them politically. So even though it was a struggle at times to step away from, kind of our own internalized production standards and conventions of narrative storytelling and reporting, we were actually only directly accountable to YWAP. And Blake, who was the lead producer on this project, was deeply committed to supporting organizing within the sex trade, and he continues to put in hours still. Cuts different versions of the audio file for the group. So that's kind of one really extreme example of a media project that was for a really specific audience that didn't have a mass market in mind, that was really internal. That was a lot about reflecting and having that political control and creative control was where it was at. It wasn't about oh, how do we reach how do we reach people who don't already understand us? So yeah, next slide, please. So this was really different, and how I came into this project was I was doing a different story in Arizona, and I was staying with my old roommate, And his new roommate was this person who gave me a ride to my rental car. And while we were in the car, she started telling me what she was doing that day, as I asked or something. And she was like, oh, I do these search and rescue missions out in the desert, and we leave gallons of water for migrants who are crossing through, and who would die because it can be like a 3-day crossing for some people before you get to the first place that has infrastructure like water. And so she started telling me too that, the number of people that were dying had been going up and up since 2001 because Border Patrol checkpoints that were being installed in these main kind of walking paths. And she said that an additional thing that was happening was when people would call it. So now at this point, most everyone has a cell phone, and they had access to 911, like the emergency number. And so people would be calling 911, but when, according to my friend Genevieve, when the operator heard a Spanish speaker who said that they were lost in the desert, they would immediately patch them to Border Patrol rather than transferring them over to regular emergency services. Like if I called or if a German tourist called, they would be patched over to the regular EMT, sheriff's office, the regular services. So I heard about that and I thought that was, completely insane. And I asked this person, Genevieve, like if I was to be able to get clearance from my editor at Al Jazeera America, could I come back and would she be down to sort of be my guide through some of this stuff? And she was really chill, and we, because we had a lot of mutual connections, I think there was a level of trust there. But it was a more classic, traditional relationship because I got the approval from my editor as a freelancer, and she gave me a budget, which included a travel budget, and I created a plan for myself to stay out in Tucson for a month and to just essentially have dedicated full-time availability to work on this project. So I let Genevieve know this, and and we very quickly were good at establishing what is it that I can do and what is it that she can do in this arrangement. So there were, I should mention too, Al Jazeera America paid me a living wage, so I was not stressed out. I was it was fine to work full time on this. Genevieve really went above and beyond the call of duty. I never felt as though I was just this kind of pain in the ass. She gave me a ton of access to their records, so she had been keeping personal records on how many search and rescue missions she was going out on. There was a hotline that people would call in, the Missing Migrant Project, and so they would get these calls from family members across the country that would say, my so-and-so went missing in May, it'd be July, and they would essentially just try to track, where did everyone go, and then try to find them in these systems, because if a person didn't die, which most of the time they were picked up by Border Patrol and deported within 48 hours. But the system for record keeping was so convoluted that, people would simply get lost in the system, and sometimes as long as years they would remain missing because the names were entered incorrectly, or they were sent to some random detention center in Iowa, or whatever the case. So that was all stuff that the databases were things that I had much more access to, on the official side of things. I was also able to have access to Border Patrol, which was a trip. So I went on a 4-hour ride-along with Border Patrol and was able to ask them all these questions about their process and their technology that, activists had never been able to really pin down before. And Border Patrol had to sort of perform for me. That was what they felt they had to do. So I had 4 hours of recordings that I transcribed into 80 pages of text, and I turned that over to the organizers, and eventually the ACLU also contacted me and used a lot of that to file a series of lawsuits that led to somewhat cosmetic changes in Border Patrol's response to emergency response networks, but still it was a thing. And I also had access to sheriff's offices, which was really interesting because, I could just call and I could say, tell me how many people tried to call you and how many calls you transferred to Border Patrol this month of this year. And for sure they would, interestingly in this case, no one tried to really hide anything. There was no shame. There was no sense of wrongdoing. So people were very open with these this data. But that was an interesting element that I could bring to this because of my outsider role. Another thing was that there, internally and amongst the left in Tucson at the time, there was so much beef. There was like all this drama happening between these different orgs, and as an outside person, I was able to completely just sail through that and not deal with it, and I could focus on the issues, and I didn't have to like choose sides, and no one expected me to participate in the mess. So that was great, and that was an asset as well. And yeah, and finally, I guess the biggest thing for me in terms of it feeling like a success is that the main person who I featured in the story, who had lost his brother and his cousin when they crossed over, and they called 911, Border Patrol, made a decision just to leave them, stop looking for them. He got a call from the agent who was flying the helicopter at the time, and essentially got an apology, and for what it's worth. But that was a thing that made me feel like this was worthwhile as a project. And so that was a really, really good project that I felt like took full advantage of what we, like, as different kinds of participants with different roles, we really figured out how to work together. I'll emphasize again that so much of it came down to kind of personal trust, like that, Genevieve at the end of the day took some risks, and I mean, journalists are not supposed to give their notes over to community groups and to lawyers. Like that's a thing. You're not, like, that's not in the anything, So I feel like both of us were very committed to the larger vision of like, how do we make this as impactful as possible? How can this save more lives or change some kind of protocol in whatever small way that can be meaningful? So yeah,
hey,
so that's, yeah.
Hey Puck, I have a question about that last thing that you said. That story is so amazing, and like we don't often, if we're focusing on activism and organizing, don't necessarily get to think about or hear the stories from like journalists who might be covering the work that we do. But could you describe a little bit more like what you just said at the end, where journalists are sort of quote unquote not supposed to share that stuff? So like we're here on a live Skillshare, like is that like how would your colleagues like react to what you're describing here, or I don't know, talk a little bit more about that norm.
I think most people, even people that I know who write for like the lefty rags that I write for, like say, The Nation or whatever, like it just wouldn't occur to them to share the notes, But then within more conventional settings, like for instance, I went to graduate school for journalism at Berkeley, like, we were explicitly told again and again that you're not supposed to like have an opinion essentially. And so if you're working with people, you're sort of treating everyone with equal suspicion. But of course that's not true, because they would talk to the cops or they get a press release from the cops and immediately be like, oh, like these people are credible, So yeah, I mean, I think like, I'm the worst person to make generalizations about groups. I'm awful at it. But like, in general, like the field of journalism in the United States at this time, like, it's not within like the understanding of the trade that you work with anyone. It's kind of this like rogue, like Wild West, like, like super like free trade sort of, So I don't know, I guess, I mentioned this story because it's possible, and that's what I like to do, and I think that there's opportunities perhaps to work with other journalists in this way. But yeah, I don't know.
Thank you. Yeah.
And then this next slide, please, Diana. So this is much more of a traditional, this is probably everyone here has done this with a journalist before. It's like very normative. It's like, so the campaign was this sanctuary city campaign, or like not just sanctuary city, but like these different churches and different cities in the U.S. had committed sometime 2 years ago to providing sanctuary for migrants who are facing deportation, like pretty imminently. And so like there was a few churches in Arizona, and there was one in Philly and one in Portland, and so just these different cities, and they, very sort of deliberately rolled out this campaign together. And they had, they had like the basic things. They had the website, they had a communications officer, they had like their, sort of talking points and blah blah blah, and like like a media packet, And I had heard about this, and I was really interested in this idea of like, sanctuary, like people taking in, like totally illegally, like migrants who were facing deportation, and they're just telling the police like, you can't come into this church, like telling the border police that they just couldn't come in. So I reached out and I said I'd like to write this article. I contacted someone at The Nation who I'd never really worked with very much. And so my editor was like really, really, really flaky. So I'm going to give some background info, because when you're interacting with a journalist, like you have no idea what's going on for them a lot of the time. So in this case, I was a freelancer again, but unlike with Al Jazeera America, The Nation does not pay anything like a living wage. I made literally a third of what I made for Al Jazeera. So furthermore, none of that was upfront, so I was fronting all this money myself, like all the travel, all the housing. So all of this was on my credit cards. During the time that I was on my trip, my editor pieced out completely. So I literally didn't hear from her for a 6-month period. So I'm like operating completely in the dark. And meanwhile, I'm working like 12-hour days, and I'm talking to these people. And again, it was this very classic arrangement where, their media team was kind of like cold and suspicious, and like, I mean, that's fine, whatever. I don't need people to be like nice to me. But I think what was kind of like gross is just that when you interact with people this way, it's like you're part of this machine, you make them part of this machine. I just felt like a tool. I looked at them like they were tools. I didn't care about their day. Like they were coming at me in this way, like, you want all this stuff, well, I want all this stuff. And then I'm like, yo, like, I just left this place with bed bugs. Like, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. I'm running up this debt on my cart. Like, it was whack. And, all of our interactions were kind of transactional and just means to an end. So even though this person who was the media contact, I actually met her years ago at a campaign for something else, it was like there was just there's no trust. It was, and the whole, it felt very performative and contrived. It was like I was sort of trotted out to these various, people, the people who were like putting their lives like in the spotlight to try to stay with their families and stuff. And I needed all this translation help, which I was very upfront about, and like that just was another element of like, removal. And then, yeah, the whole thing, it was just felt very circusy. It was like very, very conventional. I feel like this is like what we're taught to do, and it sucks. So it was fine, whatever. I charged it as my card. I ended up getting the flu. I was really sick. I had the fever for 4 days. I got the thing done. I like couldn't really tell anyone that I was interviewing or working with when the thing would publish, because my editor pieced out for 6 months. And by the time it finally did publish, it was like 9 months later. And yeah, it was just so that's like a very conventional example. Next slide, please. So yeah, at this point I would like to transition away. So I told all those kinds of stories of those experiences just to get everyone to like think about like, so we heard earlier on from 3 of you all, like ways that you've interacted with like quote media before, and it was a huge range of stuff. It sounded like, I'm not going to remember all the details, but like Harlan had a sort of more positive but also very conventional experience where it was like, yeah, sort of like interacting first with supportive like local small scale people, and then sort of like randomly like the bigger fish like were interested or something. And sometimes that happens, and usually it doesn't, to be really honest, in my observations. And then other kinds of examples where where Jess was saying like just like trying to build up this website to be really informative for community members. So that's like less about like you know, getting our story out there, and much more about like being a resource for like a very specific population. And then, you know, so so this is all just to think about like different approaches to doing the same thing, like with the same goals. So I threw up this slide just with some ideas on what media projects even are, because we've been talking about media organizing projects, but it's like, you know, we don't all mean the same thing, and there's a whole range. And so these are just some that I were off the top of my head. If anyone like has an idea or an example that they want to throw out, like we could all hear it if it's not on the list, or we could just kind of, you know, move on. But yeah, I tried to be very broad here, you know, and include stuff that's like just video recordings of like verbal testimonies, maybe at like a city council meeting, or, you know, like a fabric arts installation or a zine or murals. Like it could be whatever. That's sort of the point. Next slide. So here I thought we could, it could go a couple different ways. You could talk about what you're working on now, and we could try to come up with some different ideas for media project campaigns, or we could talk about something that you want to do in the future. In some ways, I think it could be interesting to think more about the future, because then our imaginations are not going to be constrained at all. But mostly I just want this to be like useful for the people who are here. So does anyone have like a seed for a suggestion that we can take and experiment on?
Or we could also, if people are drawing a blank, we could also like go deeper into like one of the projects that you already described. Either way.
I'm sorry, I froze up for a second. Is there any way that you could resay the question?
Resend the which thing?
Sorry, if you could repeat the question one time.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, I'm just like, you know, so the next part is going to be more hands-on, and we're going to brainstorm kind of together different media projects based on like one campaign or one kind of political goal or something. So I was just asking if anyone had a thing that we could work on together.
We can't really hear you.
Oh, sorry. Was that for me?
Yeah, were you trying to describe a thing that you want to work on, or that you imagine doing in the future?
Yeah. So I think one thing that we want to work on is creating a platform for the youth who are involved in our work to be able to share their experiences in school, as a counterpoint to like what the school system says like schools are like.
Awesome. That's a perfect thing. Let's do that one if that's cool with everyone. Okay, so next slide, please. So I put this up sort of as a way to think through. It's like you have that initial idea that we want to create a platform for youth to talk about their actual experiences in school versus what administrators and adults there are saying it is. So, so I kind of I thought of these guidelines because this happens all the time. This happens to me. It's like anytime you're working on anything, you start getting so mired in it that you know all these details and all the specifics, and it's really, really easy to stop being able to tell people what it is you're doing. So, local versus large scale. I don't actually know or remember where Jovan lives, so it's really interesting because the way that he told that story made it so that it didn't matter because like that those dynamics exist everywhere I can think of, you know, like the sort of disconnect between youth experience in schools and like, you know, the people who are running the schools. However, you know, if he had said like in Detroit or in Philly or whatever it was, like that would have been in my head as well. So there's not a, again, this isn't about like good versus bad. It's just like different, you know, like what are you choosing to emphasize? The next point too, so arcane and bureaucratic versus epic life and death stakes. You know, is the story and the problem relatable to others who don't understand the details of the situation or personally care about the main players? You know, again, it's so easy because we get absorbed in the details to like talk in acronyms and to like make it all about like, you know, in this case, I'm just gonna riff off of this. You didn't do this at all, Javon, but like, you know, to make it be all about the school board or this one school or this one legislation or this charter situation or, you know, whatever. But it's like, in reality, it's like every example, every situation we have is kind of a microcosm for these larger forces, you know, like kind of as big as we can take it. Like, so that's like that systemic analysis that we can weave in the telling of our stories. And yeah, and then the other thing so the other things I put up here is sort of like we've all been trained, or at least, you know, my experience through a lot of these like media trainings is that you have to like frame things in a way to like, you know, make it palatable for mainstream, this like fictional idea of the mainstream audience, you know. And so I put this thing up, current mass media interest or mass appeal, and I bolded, does that even matter? Because I don't think it matters at all. Like what like is popular at any given moment is really arbitrary. And, you know, it's like we do kind of our politics and our people a disservice when we try to only make certain kinds of people relatable or empathetic subjects. So that view is important to me. Like in the case of this whole thing, again, I'm totally making stuff up. But, you know, what if there was two different students that we were choosing between featuring as kind of like our protagonists for something, you know, and one of them has a record, you know, has like been to juvie several times, you know, is for a number of reasons like not a poster child, right? And then you have someone else on the other hand who like is much more poster childy, who has never had an interaction with law enforcement, you know, who let's say is like getting really good grades and is kind of on this path to like college and stuff like this, you know. And it's like there's this sort of pressure to choose the person who seems more like available, accessible to the mainstream. But my personal 2 cents is like, don't do that. And it doesn't matter because like that's not going to help you, you know. Like maybe I'll help you for a minute, but ultimately it won't. So yeah, and then, you know, can the way that the story is told build power for or support the people who are negatively affected by the problem? So this is a good example, again, with the school thing. You know, there's so many different kinds of ways that dysfunction in schools is talked about, and often it's always from this way where it like kind of victimizes or re-victimizes the students, you know, and it's kind of like, oh, it's too bad for them, you know, and it doesn't maybe even bring about an opportunity for the students to look at themselves as like potential actors and organizers in the situation, you know. I think you all know what I mean because you're like there already, but a lot of this too could be like just as well repurposed for journalists and might in fact make more sense in that context as well. And yeah, same as that last point, does the story challenge current oppressive, you know, racist, xenophobic, misogynist, pro-police and pro-prison public perceptions? Again, you could tell the story of school closings and like, say like whatever, like falling test scores or something, as, you know, oh, the city is so dysfunctional, you know, like Detroit can never get it together or something like this, you know, or like, well, what do you expect from public school anyway? You know, there's so many different kind of embedded messages in so many of the stories that are told. So anyway, that's just to kind of draw that out. And yeah, so as far as this particular case example with the school, with the youth thing, Diana, could you do the next slide, please? So if we kind of workshop this, what do you imagine, Javon, that like the content of this media project might be? Like, given that we haven't at all fleshed out, you know, what kind of media project it would be. Like, do you imagine the students creating it, like gathering the material, or could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what we struggle with is in wanting to be youth-led and youth-focused and youth-centered. How I would think of media isn't always the best way that, or the way like folks would digest it. So like sometimes, you know, I'll create stuff and folks will be like, "Can we share that on Instagram or Snapchat?" And I'm like, "Ooh, I did not think of that." So part of it is, I think, starting to think through what does it look like to create what to me would be more traditional, which might even be like Facebook posts and pictures and Instagram and whatnot. But also, like, if the students are collecting it, what does it look like to coordinate and create a campaign around Snapchat videos or around audio that's collected in the classroom, and like what are the legalities of it and all that. But I imagine a lot of it would be like content that's created or captured on a phone with voice and text and video, and trying to collate that into something effective.
Great, awesome. I love this example. It's like so perfect for for all of this. So, all right, so I'm just going to restate real quick a little bit of what you said. So the content would be largely determined by what the young people who would be collecting it, what makes sense for them. So maybe it would be Snapchat type, like videos that were shareable on Snapchat and Instagram, and some audio clips and this kind of thing. So, okay, cool. So we know what we're thinking about. Next slide, please. So
can I just say that I love how you just said that Facebook posts were a traditional thing? I love it.
Well, they are now, right? Like it's, I don't know. I feel old.
Yeah, for real.
Totally. Okay, so who we are working with, we already talked about that. Do participants consent to their involvement? You know, as this project develops, it would be pretty important to clear that on a bunch of levels. Like in this case, particularly legally, because we're talking about, you know, people under 18. You know, these are more just guiding questions. Are they in a mental, emotional, or physical condition to make consent meaningful? You know, like maybe this would be relevant if, you know, you're asking them to do this project or you're pitching this project and you're like their teacher, you know, so it's like, you know, what is this about? Like, maybe they're into it, but maybe it's, you know, there's a sense of there's not true ownership here. Yeah, what's the relationship between the media makers and the people whose story is being told? In this case, it sounds like it'd be very like pure, kind of horizontal-ish. What is the power dynamic? It's good to be aware, you know. If it was all adults interviewing all youth, like that would be a power dynamic, you know. And it's just good to know that, to be like very aware. Relationships between the media makers and the organization or paid staff. Another thing to just sort of flag, you know, like who's doing this, why, you know, like what are they accountable to? Like what is their job here? You know, what can you expect from them, like realistically? And yeah, compensation, it's just so much that defines so many of the relationships, you know, like people often, you know, I mean, so, you know, I'll use as an example, this happens to me all the time. So I'll always get contacted by different like social justice groups that like say they want to do a video documentary or collect audio recordings on like, let's say, police harassment of queer youth, you know, but the group, which like maybe has 4 staff people, wants this project to have no budget, you know, it's like going to be work done by interns and volunteers, and maybe there'll be some minimal direction by like a part-time communications staffer, you know, but like that person has like 1,200 things to do. They've never produced a media project before, you know, let alone like directed like volunteers. So then this group will call me because they want pro bono time, or maybe they can pay me like some small amount and they want me to do the training, or they want me to do like the final editing. So I would say that the structure is like so unrealistic, because more often than not, I've watched these kinds of attempts just result in collective frustration and, you know, hours of recordings, kind of like badly made recordings that collect dust, and bad feeling from the people who were interviewed for the project, and then they feel demoralized that it's like not done years later. And I'm kind of like, well, you know, you wanted interns and volunteers to do everything, and then the person who was responsible for directing them didn't have resources or support or training. You know, they had this like whole other job that was their actual job, so this was just this thing you threw at them. And so like maybe if you know, if that's the approach, and if the intern that's responsible for this project is like, that's their senior thesis, maybe that's the incentive that they'll get it done. But if that's not the case, you kind of can't expect that much, you know. And in those kinds of cases, for me, I'm like, you probably just should have hired someone, like hired contractors and producers who know how to produce media projects, if the goal was to actually finish the piece and have it be good quality. You know, but like on the other hand, if the goal is really just to train community members in public speaking and to like build these connections between your membership and say like their neighbors, you know, then maybe it's not a big deal that the project never gets finished. Like it's up to every group to decide what the priorities are, you know. So like with the school thing, like same here. Like what is, you know, does this thing actually need to get done, or is this an excuse to involve youth? Next slide, please.
Hey, so, our hour is almost up. The
oh my God!
So we might want to just like let viewers know about where they could find all of these resources, and then maybe get last thoughts from folks who are here in the call.
Totally. So I put together like a sort of more in-depth work packet of these questions that you see on the slides, and that's all on this Transformative Media, the same site that all these other workshop Skillshares are at. And there's only like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 slides left, so I'm just going to go through them really, really quick, and I won't even really talk about them, because they're the same stuff that we've already been discussing. You know, who are you working with? And like thinking about timeline and budget, like what are your priorities? You know, different projects will bring up different things. And then this was just sort of, the idea was to get you all to think of different kinds of campaigns, maybe stuff you haven't done before. But yeah, are there any like, I'm sorry, this hasn't been very participatory, but is there any thoughts or questions?
I just think this was awesome.
I got to participate.
Yeah. I just want to thank you so much. Like, there's so much valuable information here, and it's amazing to hear like your experience, you know, working on different projects and their range, and thinking, even just that fact of like thinking about interactions between activists and journalists who are also like movement supporting, and like trying to envision what that could look like differently. It's so valuable, and I can't wait to look more at all of the materials that you prepared that are up on the transformativemedia.cc site.
Yeah, I just wanted. Am I here? Yes. I just wanted to add that it was really helpful. Oh no, I'm frozen. Okay.
No, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh. I was gonna say, I think these the questions that you bring up are helpful, not just for media folks, but just folks who are doing any non-core tasks for an organization, to really think about how it's organized and start doing that work beforehand actually leads to a successful end project.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I was thinking after reading these, like your packet that you're putting together, I feel like is something I'm going to use to train all my communications people that I'm about to hire on next week. So I feel really lucky to have a perspective of a journalist and an organizer. I think you have this really unique, unicorny sort of hybrid, and the way in which you're able to navigate those two and then share tactics, I think, is so helpful. So thanks for sharing this with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's like so nice to actually interact with people on this level where you're not just forced into like one corner.
Hey Jess, do you have any final thoughts before we have to close the call out?
I just want to say again, just like thank you so much, Pak, for all this information. I'm trying to think about like how to make time for all the planning that needs to go into it, right? Because I think part of the thing is like when I think about a work plan, all the planning time isn't always put in there. And I forget about how much time it takes to actually plan all the projects.
Yeah, that makes me wonder, Puck, from your experience, like, what is the timing that, now that you bring that up, Jess, I think that's a good thing to kind of think through.
Oh my God, it's so much. So just to give let's see. So in any given, I'll try to make this as like concrete as possible. So the last film I made was about GPS ankle monitors. Like surveillance bracelets for people who pre-sentencing kind of stuff, or people who are like asylum seekers or something. So that was a film, and then now I'm about to head to the East Coast soon, and I was hearing from a friend in Philly that they were going to start a campaign about this there because they have like a huge pre-sentencing like legislation thing that's happening. So, I mean, I can expect to spend the better part of 2 or 3 full-time days just doing initial research on that before I can write a pitch to like an editor, say I want to write about this thing. So that's sort of just getting my feet wet, like basically knowing what the fuck I'm talking about. And then if I get approval, then that was, I would expect it to be a solid 2 weeks of just like figuring out what is what. And then if I'm working, I would be working probably with a group, like a community group, and they will not have time for this, which is always the case, but in order to make it work, I would need at least like a day or 2 of their time, like full days. So that would just be from my end. So if I was the community group, on the other hand, reaching out, yeah, I would have needed to spend at least that week or whatever just doing research. But then if I was to think through all the relationships and like all the specifics of what the like article would be or something, like that would probably take another few days. So it is, yeah, it's a lot of front end work, but it's all work that needs to be done anyway, and it's the work that it is campaign research work, like that's the thing. Like for groups that are doing this stuff, like you're already doing it. It's just kind of like when.
Cool. So our time is up, so we have to close it out. But thanks again, Puck, for an awesome Skillshare, and for everybody who's been watching, or if you're looking at this video later on, you can find all the materials that Puck presented, including the slides and notes, as well as a more detailed worksheet with critical questions to ask yourself about your media organizing work at transformativemedia.cc. So check that out, and thanks again, Puck. It was great to have you with us.
Thank you so much. It was so nice to talk to you all. Bye.
Bye.